Shivan Dragon, a 6-mana 5/5 flyer with fire breathing, a mechanic respectfully named by the player base that allows you to pay 1 red mana for 1 added attack on a creature. In the current climate of Magic the Gathering, a creature like this would be likely an uncommon caliber card. Still, Shivan Dragon has become one of the most iconic of MTG's long history. Let's explore the competitive history of Shivan Dragon and how exactly it became such an integral part of the game's culture, all by asking the questions, how good was Shivan Dragon really, and why is it iconic? In the early days of Magic's competitive scene, there really wasn't much to it.
Hey everybody, an old man's talking!
For Alpha, there were really just 2 major tournaments between 1994 and 1995, those both being World Tournaments, 94 in Milwaukee and 95 in Seattle. Between those 2 events, how many decks featured Shivan Dragon? The reality is that while the card pool was relatively low compared to today, and Shivan Dragon seemed pretty well statted for the time, even during these alpha tournaments, this creature didn't see much play. In Worlds 94, only one top 8 deck, a Zoo deck played by Cyril de Foucauld, featured Shivan Dragon. Worse still, this Zoo deck only utilized a single copy of the dragon, favoring other creatures like Serendib Ifrit and Kurdape, which helped close out games faster than getting Shivan Dragon out and pumping its fire breathing. Even back during these early days, players realized that cheaper, more reliable creatures surpassed bombs in competitive play. Take Kurdape for example, a 2/3 effectively for a single mana was just so much value to ignore in any deck whose objective was to win quickly, or base their win conditions on the quality of creatures themselves. Likewise for the aforementioned Serendib Ifrit. For 3 mana less than Shivan Dragon, you got a 3/4 body with flying, with the supposed drawback of taking 1 damage yourself at the start of your upkeep. Players then, like players today, knew that your life was a resource, and this tiny ping in damage was a small price to pay for this effective body. By this time, another flyer was starting to take the professional scene by storm, another icon in the MTG community, Serra Angel. It cost 1 mana less than Shivan Dragon with smaller stats and no fire breathing, but the addition of Vigilance, which helped it both punish opponents and protect the player, offering the best of both worlds in terms of offense and defense. Despite how we, the players, fondly look back on Shivan Dragon today, the card itself wasn't really impactful to the early history of the MTG competitive scene. No matter how many times Shivan Dragon was reprinted, and believe me, it's seen a lot of printings, the card just never really took hold in any constructed format. It's been in Standard for years, but the card just doesn't do enough for its cost to warrant any sort of include or build around.
That's a lot of
Shivan Dragon.
How about a little more?
For a rare, it's been outclassed for a really long time, and there's really no hope that any environment would likely open a spot for Shivan Dragon to do, well, anything at a real competitive level. Now that's not to say in some limited formats that the card shares a similar fate. Limited formats like Draft and Sealed give cards like Shivan Dragon an opportunity to shine, going against other decks just trying to get the best card possible. As a 5/5 flyer for 6 alone, Shivan Dragon is seen as a decent bomb for limited formats. This doesn't mean strictly that the card is good, but that its efficiency has an asterisk next to it. While it may be doo-doo in constructed formats, the body is hypothetically decent for a limited bomb, but still on the weaker side of things, more like an uncommon than a rare. And all of that of course depends on what set you're drafting it in. Yeah, there's a lot of ifs and buts and variables, but if you squint really hard and your pools are pretty poopy, then Shivan Dragon may be acceptable. So if it really wasn't all that good as a competitive card, then how did it become so iconic? Sometimes a card doesn't need to define a format or cost your firstborn soul to become iconic in Magic the Gathering. Sometimes it just has to be your first, because we always look fondly on our firsts. To many of veteran players, their first came with Alpha, the very beginning of Magic the Gathering, and the starting point for the Shivan Dragon. Yes, Shivan Dragon is an OG card from the very birth of this card game. which alone places it in a unique category for most players regardless of its playability. Nostalgia for the first expansion in MTG has, of course, generated a lot of iconic cards, chief among them being cards like Black Lotus, the holy grail of Magic the Gathering. But that's not to diminish the value of a card like Shivan Dragon, and what it brings to those looking to pine for the original set. Of course, that nostalgia will cost you a pretty penny. The coveted Alpha Shivan Dragon, with this iconic art by Melissa Benson, can sell for thousands to tens of thousands of dollars US depending on its condition. But in reality, its price tag is merely a representation of its iconic status within the community. It doesn't really answer the question, why do players love this dragon so much? Back when the game first dropped in August of 1993, the market of tabletop card games had a very particular customer base. Nerd! And I'm talking hardcore nerds, true-born 80s Dungeons & Dragons nerds. To corner this market, Magic the Gathering needed two things: magic, which is in the name, and of course, mystical monsters. And what monster could be more appealing to fans of Dungeons & Dragons than, you guessed it, dragons. As these players escaped their dungeons and cracked packs, naturally they had predisposed biases towards the monsters they've already experienced through their imaginative campaigns. And when they saw the Shivan Dragon, a red dragon with strong stats, well, it was simply love at first sight. One that left a lasting impression on the original player base that continued to permeate the culture of the game itself. Mixing feelings between D&D and MTG wasn't the only thing spurring Shivan Dragon's iconic status though. This card to a casual crowd was really good. It was the biggest dragon, stat-wise, in the early stages of the game's life. In fact, there were only 4 other creatures who had a higher offensive stat than Shivan Dragon: Force of Nature, Lord of Pit, Crawlworm, and Personal Incarnation. All of which, with Crawlworm as an exception, cost 3 or more of their dedicated mana source. By comparison, Shivan Dragon was a huge body that was relatively easy to play with an added stat boost ability with fire breathing that pushed it ahead of its competitors. The fact that it also had flying, meaning it could swing in directly, saw a lot of players abusing their friends at the lunch table. It's an easy card to understand and use. Big dragon, fly in, gets bigger for more mana. And back in Alpha, there just weren't as many ways to deal with a threat like that. For its simplicity and effectiveness, much of the player base fell in love with Shivan Dragon, leading to the nostalgic feeling many of us share today. Regardless of its professional performance, Shivan Dragon has been reprinted several times over the course of MTG history.
Oh, I gotta get rid of these guys.
As a staple in the Magic community, typically a new Shivan Dragon reprint would drop with edition sets. Sets designed to be shallower in scope and card functionality, making them great for new players to get into the game. This is where Shivan Dragon continues to serve our game today, being an easy to understand and utilize bomb that's unintimidating to most new players. Just put yourself in the shoes of someone seeing a Magic card for the very first time. Would you rather play with a card like Shivan Dragon or a card like Limdol's Vault? Yeah, that card text, a little intimidating. Because of that accessibility, Shivan Dragon has been reprinted as of the making of this video 22 different times. And just look at the sets it's been featured in. Editions 7 through 10, From the Vault Dragons, Magic Core Set 10, 14, 17, 19, and 20, and even Magic Origins, which was the rebirth of core sets in MTG. This proves that Shivan Dragon stands as one of the most ideal teaching cards the game has to offer. It's not just some throwaway creature whose only stats, like a bear, offering up players their first chance to actually interact with a creature they summon, but still being user-friendly enough as to not frighten away from its use. In this video, I wanted to answer a few questions. Was Shivan Dragon good, and why did it become so iconic? Sometimes, for some cards, those two answers are one and the same. A card is great, it defines a format for a time, and thus it is easily recognizable by the player base and is iconic. From what we know of Shivan Dragon's competitive performance, or lack thereof, it's clear that this creature never performed at a level that would grant its iconic status within the community. But power isn't everything in MTG. To make a lasting impression, a card just simply has to impact enough players at a time that they can most recognize that card's influence on their journey in this hobby. Shivan Dragon is a great example of a card that didn't have to win a bunch of tournaments to do just that. Touch the lives of players. In what I would say is a more healthy and genuine way, Shivan Dragon became iconic because it was there as we learned to play the game. It was a bomb our eyes first locked onto when cracking a pack. It was the first creature we terrorized our friends with. It was the first time we planned out our combat phase, calculating our mountains to make sure we had lethal. In that, Shivan Dragon will last longer in players' hearts than if it steamrolled standard. And that means quite a bit in this community. Shivan Dragon may not be technically good, but it sure is iconic.